Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brenniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Marti Spiegelman, and she has had a fantastic career doing a wide variety of things that really parallel some of the things I do, but many of the other people that have been on the podcast also parallel what she does. And she's one of those experts that I think we look to for wisdom and insight. And so I'm glad you're here, Marti.
Ed, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for asking me. Real pleasure.
So give us a little idea of what you actually do. What's your...
It's a little hard to put in a nutshell, but I would say what I do now is I help people understand how consciousness works. And I use a lot of different lenses, some indigenous, some scientific, some lenses through my design career, a lot of different ways of looking at it. But it is possible to know what consciousness is, the universal consciousness and all the other levels of consciousness. And then I help people understand how human consciousness works and how it fits into the bigger scheme of things. Because humans have been on a 2,000-year track of becoming separate from everything around them. And we're in a moment in our existence here on beautiful planet Earth where we're, I think, beginning to realize we have to course correct. So that's what
I want you to go back and say a little bit more about what you just said about this 2,000-year trajectory where we have been separating ourselves. What are we separating ourselves from?
We're separating ourselves from the world that we live in and the systems of life that bring us into being and support us. So it's pretty radical. And the way I talk about it, it may have been going on longer, but I've just used a few moments in history to illustrate the problem. If we go back to the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, where essentially the Greek culture arose and then the Romans, and it was like the birthplace of what we call Western culture these days. Yeah. Right. And before that time, if we look at the few records that we have evidence of humans walking, literally walking the entire planet, one continent to the next, before anything that we would call agriculture or civilization or towns and so on, the way we live now. And when we were walking the earth, we were living like everything else in nature, in direct relationship to nature. Mm-hmm. And if I'm living like that and I'm walking and I get my food from the forest every day or from the river every day, the way the elders talk about it now is that I would have been informed by the powers around me where the best fish would be for that day, where the best, whatever I'm hunting in the forest would be that day. And I would be taught by my surroundings how to make relationship with my food, how to catch it, how to give some offering in return. So humans were living in this great exchange, just like everything else in nature. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Everything in nature lives in this exchange, right? We could talk for weeks on that. But I think what happened as we settled down and what our Western civilization began to emerge in the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, what happened was at some point we got very interested in what's inside us. We'd been living relative to what's around us, mm-hmm. and we're very complex beings. So one day somebody said, well, okay, all that's really fine, but what about what's inside us? How is it that I have this sense of me? And how is it that I'm having these thoughts? And what about language? And what is all this inside me? Yeah. So it's like a bifurcation point in chaos theory. We're trundling along going one way, and at some unpredictable point, we'll take a different route. Yeah. So instead of going outward, we went inward. And it's okay. It's fine. But what happened to us is that we got so interested in the inside that we forgot the outside. Yeah. And we got so interested in thinking and figuring and explaining and defining that we lost our direct sensory connection to the great forces around us. Yeah. And what happens in our neurophysiology is if we take our awareness off of larger forces and we go too far inward, we won't know the larger forces. We don't have a relationship with them. And so what begins to happen is the limbic fear circuit starts to attune to a smaller radar screen. And we can still sense that, like earthquakes and winds and all the big forces of nature, we can sense it. But if we don't know it, we'll have a fear response to it and we'll armor against it. So you can track in early civilization where we stopped being in relationship to nature and we started to try to control it.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, our first buildings were built in relationship to light when we were still connected to the universe, and the light entered the temples. And just like the Kogi build their sacred huts, we did that too. The beautiful oculi in Rome and those beautiful buildings. But eventually, we ended up paving the earth. Eventually, we ended up controlling the waters. Building aqueducts, which indigenous people would never do. You leave sources where they are and you go to them. Yeah. There's a quote I found that just, I think, is jaw-dropping. I believe it was Heraclitus who said, "It's dangerous to think in sunlight." So we reached the point where thinking was primary. This is all prefrontal cortex. So not our direct sensing systems. We're totally up here. And then the prefrontal cortex has a direct connection to the limbic fear circuit. So we're trapped in this tiny little loop. And the more we're afraid of something, the more we push it away, the more we try to control it, and so on. So it also happened in our societal structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we're trapped in this part of our brain, it's very linear. It's linear processing. And it has a function in terms of our whole consciousness. But if you only have the linear processing, everything becomes A to B to C. Everything in the vertical reality becomes hierarchical. Yeah. And we began to put power at the top and weakness at the bottom.
Yeah.
So the things that we built, they lasted for a while, but then they crashed. And we've just never stepped off that conveyor belt.
Let me add reflection on what you just said, and this
Yeah.
is something I've been thinking about for a couple of years now, and I'm trying to understand consciousness or spirituality, or these concepts.
Yeah.
Because what I was finding is that people were personalizing consciousness and personalizing spirituality as some kind of possession of theirs. And what they were actually doing was isolating themselves from other
Mm-hmm.
people, but also
Mm-hmm.
nature.
Yeah.
And when I in 2015, when I moved to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, to live there in the midst of those mountains, one of the
Mm-hmm.
reasons was I felt that when I'm there in those mountains, I feel that there is order, which is healthy and natural, which is I am small, they are big, and I must respect them and not seek to dominate them. And
Mm-hmm.
so and so it's kind of taken it to we are in relationship with all things. But
Yes.
and I think it goes back to the Greeks, as you were pointing. We are seeking to create all kinds of mediating structures, institutions,
Mm-hmm.
ideas that put a buffer between us and nature, a buffer or between reality, so that we don't really have to deal with it.
Right.
We can just play the game, and we can, and I think
Mm-hmm.
all of that's coming to an end.
I think so too. And I think that's what people are sensing. The few people who will say to us, we talked about this a little bit before, that they sense something is changing or something's coming, and that they can't quite say what it is. But I think um, our structured way, our overly linear, hierarchical way is coming to an end. It is simply not sustainable in the larger system of a conscious universe. It will crumble.
And so, what are people asking you or talking to you about? When they come to you, what's the kind of the nugget of
Mm.
concern that they have?
Well, most people will come to me with what we just said. They will come to me saying, I know there's something else. I just know there's something else. I've tried all the workshops. I've got this big sense that I can give something into the world. I know I can, but I'm too afraid to do it, or I try and it fails, or I have a great idea and nobody listens, but there's got to be something.
Yeah.
And they've done everything else. And they say, what do I do? so so I think that since those people who are trying to emerge into another dimension of existence, and I'm not talking about woo-woo stuff, I'm talking about being fully alive in the beautiful world that we have. It's like people have been pressed down into two dimensions, and some of them are remembering there's a third one. Yeah, and they're trying to break free. And those are the people who come to me, and they actually, most of them don't know anything. They don't even know that what they're seeking is full consciousness, but they're hungry and they're desperate because nothing else has quote unquote worked.
So, I mean, one of the ways that consciousness is referred to, kind of in the broad scope of that, is to
Mhm.
say when we become conscious, we become aware. Or
Yeah.
aware of reality or aware of the world. What does that mean? What does it mean to be aware?
This is the crux right here. And we're going to have a little linguistic trouble because the English language fails us in these kind of conversations. So I'll holler if I say anything confusing. This business, well, let's go to what the Yaqui masters in central Mexico say, which is really beautiful. They say that they're talking about humans, and they say that the core of our being is the act of perception, and the magic of our being is the act of awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, wow, that's really brilliant. So I looked up perception and I went back to the Greek and Latin roots, and turns out perception means to know the world through the senses.
Mm-hmm.
And we use the word perception kind of subjectively, but the human sensing systems just biologically are the most accurate thing around. It's astonishing. Yeah. And so in my understanding of this, perception and awareness, the act of perception, the act of awareness, comprise the foundation of human consciousness, which is a dynamic state of being. Yeah. And awareness, it's we use the word in so many subjective ways that when I take people into the first levels of training, they have a hard time identifying their own awareness. I ask people, what's in your awareness? And they go to thoughts, they don't go to sensing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So awareness is this magical capacity to recognize, if you will, precise sensory data in the world around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that data is coming into us 24/7. You actually cannot stop it. Even if your heart stops, your whole nervous system is still collecting data and it's getting registered in your brain, your nervous system, your skin, your cells. Um, and what we're seeking right now, I think the people who come and say, God, it's got to be something else, is they're feeling in a very primordial way that their awareness wants to unfurl. They want to be aware of what is going on around them instead of just being aware of themselves. Because even biologically, if I get caught inside myself, my biology tells me that that's dangerous because I don't know anything about my surroundings. So how am I even going to take care of myself? Yeah. Um, so awareness it's key. And if you ask somebody, what are you aware of right now? Most people won't be able to tell you. Another big chunk of people will talk about themselves. And very, very, very few people will say they are aware of the change in the wind and the sound of the earth and the warmth of the stars. Very few people have that big sensibility. But what we call consciousness is the complete activation of our perception skills and our awareness skills, being aware of the data coming in. And from there, everything else we're seeking starts to arise.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need 3 steps to nirvana. We don't need an external framework.
Right.
And I love how you said that we're putting these frameworks between us and the rest of it so we don't have to deal with it. That whole idea of a framework, a strategy dissolves because consciousness doesn't need it, doesn't work that way. Consciousness gives us answers immediately as we're in our experience, if our perception and our awareness skills are fully opened.
Well, I think we can see this taking place as the attempt to hold on to the institutional structure of the world that we've lived with for 200 or 300 years, 400
Yeah.
years, is failing. And I mean, I have this conversation a lot, and I've been talking about this for 20 years. It's failing, and the question is, what is it? What's going to replace it? And people don't know because they're not aware, and they're not even. It's not that they don't believe in relationships. They value their relationships, but they don't understand what those relationships actually constitute, and that they're a form of a circuit of, a network, that you're networking these circuits together so that together you begin to have a sense of the broader scope of what's taking place around you.
Right.
And so
That's how consciousness works. What you just said, that's how it works.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So instead of going out and imagining some framework that we're going to impose on everything and hoping that'll work, it won't work. The way it works is what you just said. We start from the heart of who we are. So we have to be courageous enough, somehow, quote unquote, healed enough to be ourselves, and then begin to flow our beingness, our gifts, our intelligence, our love out into the world. And that makes connections. And then there's feedback. And in this active relating, that's where the downloads, if you will, come about the next best thing.
Yeah.
It will never work if we create a separate framework and impose it. And one of the things, so I can put on my scientist hat a little bit here, one of the things that I think helps Western people is to talk about how the brain processes information. We have gotten to the point, this is a little bit what I was talking about before, we've gotten to the point where our awareness is pretty much only working in a tiny little part of our brain that's very important to us, but is not meant to work alone. But if I'm only aware in this little part of my brain that its job is linear processing, its job is to take a map of action from the big part of us and follow the map A to B to C. And if there's trouble at point B, there's a B prime. So it's A to B to C, either or. A to B to C, either or. This part of the brain is not wired directly to the world via the senses. All it knows is a given map, a structure, and linearity and causality, and either or. That's it. So if you could imagine everybody living in that tiny little segment that processes information in that way, you have our world. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's either or. Me or you, honey. Right? And we need a structure. Now, if we get a few people trained, if you will, a few people skilled in the use of awareness, so their awareness is mostly on the world and the part of their brain that creates all those maps is primary, then they are using their relational intelligence to take current data, real-time data, and create.
Yeah.
That's where we see the new frameworks that will help us. If we're only awake in the other part, we're in jet lag, we don't understand the world, we're constantly going off track.
Yeah. And, there's been a lot of work on this over the last 100 years.
Yep.
And that whole movement in philosophy called phenomenology was really about putting into an academic environment a recognition of the senses as as a place of receiving information that allowed us to process to understand what was going
Yeah.
on. And
Yeah.
that and I don't think we really appreciated how significant that development was.
Exactly. We didn't, because in an academic setting, in a field like philosophy, we're only describing and explaining. We have no idea how to live the experience.
Yeah.
And what we're missing is experience. People are afraid to have their experience. They're afraid to have an experience in nature. You know, I once had a group of CEOs here for a little intro afternoon seminar, and I sent everybody out to notice beauty. And there's a lot of beauty on my property. And after a few minutes, this one young CEO comes out of the forest, and he's holding something in his fingers way away from him, as long as his arm is, and his eyes are kind of bugging out. And he's picked a rare woodland orchid. So I didn't know whether to kiss him or
Oh,
punch him. It's like,
oh,
you're supposed
oh,
to pick them. But he's holding it out like this, and he says, "This is scary." And he meant it.
wow.
And that's how many, many, many people are. Some of our biggest thinkers, the philosophers, they're terrified of that beautiful world out there, that magical world that does not need language, that is supporting us, that is asking for an honest exchange with us. Yeah. And one of the things that I wanted to be sure to say when you were talking about living in those mountains and that feeling that you got, I want to suggest that part of that beautiful feeling you got, that there's something bigger. It's not just that we have to respect it. We belong to it.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely.
There's that membership is what I think most modern people are feeling. Nobody knows they belong to anything. And it's gotten to the point where, you know, we talk about indigenous wisdom. I hate the word indigenous because it's our word for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's original human wisdom. And we belong to that wisdom. And
And
we're being asked to wake up to that again and wake up to that way of being again.
so much of that was never captured in language, written language.
Of course not, because it's experiential.
That's right.
The way we learn everything, like it or not, is via experience. Language is an outcome of experiential data that we collect. It's a complete outcome. So if you're focused on language and thinking, you're only looking at the outcome. You have no idea where anything comes from. And then you think, you were talking about people getting a sense of owning. If I'm only focused on outcome, I'm going to start to think that it's all coming from me. And so my awareness gets glued to the ego level of my consciousness. And the ego, it's designed for bonding.
Hmm.
It's supposed to be for our personality, so we bond and we stay together. But if I don't have anything else, the ego also starts to bond to everything else. And then there's this misplaced sense of I own it and I control it and so on. So again, it's where's our awareness working?
Well, I mean, we're probably close in age, and I think one of the things we find as we get older is that how unimportant it is to possess things,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that we want to travel lighter and be
Hmm.
less obligated to the maintenance and the sustaining of the physical culture that we've acquired over our lifetime.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. That's true.
having moved in the last 2 weeks, I'm very aware of that. And but
Yeah.
my physical culture takes primarily the form of books. So
Hmm.
I have a
Hmm.
library that is waiting to be ordered into bookshelves, and
Yeah.
but that's really all that I bring, you know, and it's an interesting thing. So here's where I wonder how people who are locked into institutional structures that are extraordinarily hierarchical,
Mhm.
siloed, they're compartmentalized. How do they find a way to deal with this need? Because some of these people, it's kind of a corporate culture type of thing. I'm hearing these words of, I sense something is happening from these people. They're sensing something's happening. So how do we help those people who are kind of
Mhm.
captive to the structures, the institutional structures of the modern world? How do we help them?
I think this is one of our biggest problems, our biggest challenges, because ultimately, if the organization is big enough, somebody who's trapped in that framework may not be able to do very much. They may be forced to break free and do their own thing.
Yeah.
And that's a big challenge. That's a big thing to say to somebody who's got a good job and a good salary and benefits. And what do you mean, go out on my own? Are you crazy? So I think one of the things that we need to understand is, and this requires a really big radar screen. We have to look at the very, very big picture, that the world is changing on all levels, geologically, socially, energetically, everything. It's changing and there's no going back. So, number one, if we can accept that it's changing, and those of us who are able learn to move with the forces of change, that's a big step. Um, the second thing is, in this big change, there are a lot of big organizations that will not change. They will be disassembled, because when things change, some stuff has to come apart so new stuff can come together. And we're not good at change. We're even worse than we used to be
Yeah.
as a species. Yeah, and so that's really tough. Um, but some of these larger organizations, they're just not going to survive. Um, Others, and I have colleagues who work in big organizations. Other big organizations, there are pockets within them where there's somebody who's got enough position in that old hierarchy who can say, okay, we can at least here do something different.
Mhm.
And if there's somebody who has enough power and position to say, let's do it different, then those people really need to find somebody who can help them learn how to use awareness and do things more organically. Because sometimes that can ripple out into the whole organization. It can't always, but sometimes it can. And the ripple effect of consciousness is just awesome. It's awesome. I have one wonderful woman who worked with me for a very, very long time, and she was a supervisor in a local school district here in Central California, a very big district. And she really got the training, and she went through the initiation stages and stuff. And all she did at work was be conscious. She didn't teach anybody, here's the principle of consciousness. She didn't do any of that. She just exercised consciousness. So she was different in her negotiation. She was different in how she treated people, how she saw people, solve problems. The ripple effect was phenomenal. It became I think it was named the happiest school district in all of California. The teachers who weren't well suited self-selected and got different jobs, more
Yep.
money flowed in. Everything worked better just because one person mastered awareness and learned the principles. That's it. So within a big organization, even if you're in an organization, you don't want to leave your job, there's nobody around you who's conscious, the very first thing to do is to realize that that's how they are, and you don't have to be the same way.
I had
You
a guy
you
come
can
up.
be conscious and have a ripple effect.
I had a guy come up to me at a book event in
Mhm.
Salt Lake City. Well, this is 5 years ago. Big guy, big hulky guy, and I asked him, "So what do you do?" He says, "Well, I'm a welder for one of the mining companies on the lake, so on the Great Salt Lake." I said, "Well, how's that going for you?" He says, "Well, I've been doing it for a long time, and I keep asking them to let me do some more, something else in addition.
Mhm.
They don't want to give me anything else to do. They just want me to do my
Mhm.
welding stuff." I said, "Well, well, if they won't let you, then why don't you do something outside of the company?
Yeah.
And I says, why don't you go to take some courses at the community college in metal fabrication and blend your metal fabrication skills and your welding skills and create works of public art. And the look on his face was just priceless because
Right.
he had never thought about
Yeah.
being an artist.
Hmm.
I wish I had his, his name, his phone number, because I would like to know what happened. But
Yeah, I would
I think
too.
that's one of the things that's happening is that people are finding a side
Mhm.
hustle, they call it a side hustle or a side gig
Yeah.
that touches that deeply conscious part of them, and
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
want to go back to the other way of doing things.
Exactly. I mean, this is so beautiful, Ed, that our nature is to blossom. This is a principle of consciousness, the germination and blossoming into states of fulfillment. We must do that. We
Yeah.
must. That's life. That's consciousness at work. And if we will act on that impulse, all kinds of marvelous things happen. And this isn't like the science of happiness or anything. It takes courage, and you have to really make a big relationship with yourself, and you have to feel yourself and say, yes, I am more empowered, happier, stronger doing this thing. I'm going to risk it. Everything that lives successfully takes risks. And
So,
so I think that's part of it. But I love your suggestion because you encourage that guy to go blossom himself, and that's conscious.
well, let me ask you this question, and this is also kind of a current question in my mind. We talk in the world a lot about the need to change the way we are organizing businesses and organizations.
Mm.
We talk a lot about structure. We talk a lot about strategy. We talk a lot about the mechanics of that,
Mm.
as if that's where the solution is.
Mm.
And and I'm wondering if that's not where we put our emphasis, but rather if we were to spend our time building relationships and learning how to collaborate, and learning how to communicate, learning how to treat people with
Mhm.
respect and dignity, to be more conscious, that would ultimately be the environment where all that institutional change would take place.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. That all that stuff about changing how we create a business, they're working with the endpoint. They're working with the framework. A conscious framework evolves from the flow of our awareness out into the world, the connections that get made and the connections that resonate, if we tend them well, eventually show us the framework that will continue to support the flow of our awareness and our conscious actions. It's fluidity first, then connectivity, then framework. Those are principles of consciousness. That's how a so-called organization or framework appears. We have to flow out into the world and connect first, and keep doing that until we know we're given the idea, the vision of the framework that's emerging. But see, one of the things here, it's like you said earlier, we're always focusing on something that separates us from the real issue. I've worked with so many elders around the world, and I've worked deep in some of the oldest wisdom traditions. And every single human wisdom tradition will tell you it starts with the individual. Yeah. You
Mhm.
need to find, and this is hard in the Western world because we don't have the belonging that indigenous cultures brought their children into, but we really need to experience ourselves,
Yeah.
and not psychologically alone. This means um, it's like you in the mountains, it's like me in the Arctic, being ourselves in such a large, wild, powerful environment that we experience our belonging,
Hmm.
and we get to know ourselves relative to that belonging. And that's who we actually are. And it develops our awareness beyond the ego level of consciousness. And we begin to experience our connectivity, our grounding into earth. We begin to hear the speech of nature, if you will, even if it's just an appreciation of wind or sunlight or something. That's the beginning. And, it's so hard to do with modern people because it's so hard for modern people to get into that kind of nature. But this is sort of the challenge of what I do, is how can I give people a gateway so they can find that connection.
Yeah.
And if we find that connection, we find ourselves and are willing to be ourselves. In that same moment, we find our connection into the world. And then the world begins to inform us. And it's this big exchange. And if we do that, everything we're seeking is given to us. I mean, you think about my student who was the supervisor of that enormous school district. She didn't sit down everybody and give them instructions. She just lived her conscious self.
I'm curious about you,
Mm-hmm.
and if you remember the moment when you became conscious.
I think I do. I remember in my early life having to protect large segments of my consciousness. I know that for sure. But it was, I believe, my first trip to Alaska in 1983. And I knew I needed a vacation, and I got this catalog in the mail. I hadn't even asked for it. And I opened it to their August trips, and there was 2 weeks in Alaska. And I said, okay, I guess I'll do that. And those 2 weeks in that, we had wild weather. It was so wild. They laughed about that trip for 10 years. It was hysterical. But those 2 weeks in that raw, beautiful landscape, that was it. And I kept going back to Alaska for years and years. I would do 2 or 3 trips back to back. And the farther north I went, the farther north I wanted to go. So I ended up exploring a lot of the Arctic. And
Wow.
I know it was that land. It was that land. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's on my to-do list. I've thought about this. This moment. These are moments of transition,
Yeah.
and if we take them seriously, then they are moments that we consolidate into a new life.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So when I was 17, I grew up in the church, but I didn't. Before I was 17, I never thought about God. God was not. We didn't. That just wasn't
Mm-hmm.
part of the conversation. Church was church, and it was a happy place. And I was off on a youth retreat, and one of the guys in the group was being very honest about his life, and all of a sudden there was this denouement of, well, if he is this honest, there must be a God.
Hmm.
I became aware
Yeah.
of something, whatever you want to call that, of
Right. Mm-hmm.
higher power, whatever. I associated with the Christian God of the Bible. That's what I
Mm-hmm.
associate with.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay, if this is real, then I'm going to follow this, which liberated me to do whatever I want to do.
Oh.
And let's see, it was, I gotta get the dates right. Almost 30 years later, I have my family, and we're in Jackson Hole, and we're at a dude ranch, and we're riding. We come round the bend, and there are the Tetons, and I hear a voice. It's time to stop talking about leadership, and lead.
Wow.
Same kind of
Mm-hmm.
awareness. And so everything that was presented to me from that point on till today, that opportunity to lead, I've said yes to.
Yeah.
Without I mean, not without thought, but with not a whole lot of thought.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's given into our awareness. It really is. And, I always think English is such a poor language because it sounds better if I could say this in Quechua or Sanskrit or something. But it's really true that the larger system, if you will, is speaking us into being and giving into us direction and information and guidance and power and everything.
So,
It's how it works. Yeah.
if and we're coming to the time to close, but here's my last question for you.
Yeah.
What do people need to do who are hearing something for the first time about this? What's
Mhm.
what's their first step that just doesn't overwhelm them with the enormity and the largeness of what we're talking about?
Yeah. The first step is to find something in nature and spend a lot of time with it and see if you can be with whatever that thing in nature is, that place in nature. Can you just be there, experience it through your senses without thinking? No
Mm.
naming, no story, no explanation, no merging, nothing in your prefrontal cortex, pure sensory experience, and see what happens to you.
Do they need to share that with someone?
It's very good. Yes, very good point. It's very good if they can share it with someone who won't pick it apart. It's nice to have a partner to do this with, so you do share. But don't wait for somebody else to join you. Just go do it.
Yeah.
If there's no one to share it with, get a little recorder. We all have our smartphones with a voice recording app, right? And tell yourself, record it and listen back. That works.
Yeah, I've done that before. So,
Yeah, it really does work. And journaling works. And another thing, if nature is like, I can't get into nature, here's another thing that works. You get yourself a little pocket notebook and a pen that you always carry with you.
mhm.
And you pay attention to things that come into your awareness. Ta-da! Like ideas, colors, a sound that caught your attention in the middle of a meeting, doodles sometimes. You
Uh-huh.
keep recording all the stuff that is actually delivered into your awareness. And that begins to wake your awareness up. And pretty soon you'll find you're connected to your world in a very different way. You feel differently, better about yourself. Your creative ideas are fuller, richer. You're more fluid.
Yeah, that's really great. I really like that. Okay, actually, this is going to be my last question for you.
Oh, I actually don't want to stop. Keep going.
I know, I know. Well, I want to know um, if you have hope for the future, and if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, I do have hope for the future. It's going to be a very difficult journey there because
Yeah.
we are an overpopulated species, and every other species on the planet, when there's overpopulation, there's a die-off. And so there will be, I think, within the next 100 years, the human population will decrease, and that's always difficult. But I have hope for the future because I believe in consciousness, and consciousness is on the move, and we can't stop it.
Yeah.
We just can't stop it. I also have hope because there are more Indigenous elders who are realizing that Western people need the wisdom. So they're becoming more open in sharing the wisdom and helping people understand it. And that's really the basis of my work is I'm being asked to pass the wisdom on and initiate people who are ready for that. Because the wisdom belongs to all of us, and we need to understand it, embody it, and figure out how to use it in our world. So I have tremendous hope for the future. Yeah.
So if people wanted to get in touch with you and have a conversation or get involved with your work or ask you to help with them with their organization, whatever it may be, how do they find you?
The best way is just send me an email, and it's easy. It's martispiegelman@mac.com.
Okay, we'll put that in the show notes.
Great, thank you. Yeah,
And I know you welcome that because, well,
I do. I do. Yeah,
every encounter is an encounter in consciousness.
exactly. Yeah, exactly right.
It
Well
is.
said. Yeah.
You know, Marty, I'll just say this. One of the wonderful things about doing this podcast is that I'm meeting people who I'm finding such affinity with because of our shared sense of the way the world is becoming. And
Mhm.
I thank you for what you have accomplished and what you have done and how you have influenced people and the impact you're having on the world. So I want to thank you and very pleased and honored to have had you on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Ed. Those are beautiful words, and I take them into my heart. I really appreciate that, and I'm delighted to be getting to know you. I feel the same affinity, and we need to keep bringing these discussions out to people in the world. So thank you so much.
Totally agree. Well, thank you, Marty. And thank you everyone for watching. And if you would sign up, hit the like button, but even more so, leave a comment so we know that how this affects you. And maybe you have a question. You know, if you have a question, we'll answer it. We'll engage with you in conversation. Um, and I'm grateful for when you do that. So thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.